Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho, and tonight we're going back to our series called Occult and Crochet, where we start off with going over some of the cool things I do with crocheting, and then we'll go into our occult aspect. So to start with, these are some of the dishcloths that I've been making here lately. And they're a good size. They're 100% cotton, which is really nice. They last for an exceptionally long time. The colors, thanks to my weird camera right now, are a little different, but they're been working on these a lot. There's several of them up on my website. I'll be adding some more color patterns here soon. But right now we've got blues, greens, yellow and oranges, and then there's kind of a brown yellow. This one's like brown yellow. This color here is a bit purpley, but that's what I've been working on. I still have not finished the big shawl yet because I had an event this weekend, so I was more focused on getting that going, and that's where these all come into. So otherwise, we're gonna hop over to our occult side, and I want to do something a little different with this one. I've been going over individual people, which is fun, and you get into some interesting things about them. But I'm not going over a specific person in this particular trial, mainly because I couldn't find just one person to attach to it that I could find any information about anyway. So this is going to be a group of people over a period of time, and I want to introduce you to the Valais. I know the name doesn't look like that, but it's kind of a French name, witch trials. This set of trials is considered to be the very first in European witch trials. So it's the beginning of this nightmare that continues for over 300 years in Europe. There's so much bloodshed for something that has no basis in actual spirituality, and it all started in this time period that we're about to jump into. So off to Europe we go, and into Switzerland and the House of Savoy. Here we have the Diocese of Sion, and this particular diocese is a Latin ecclesiastical, not sure what my problem is tonight, area in the Alps. It is thought to be the oldest bishopric in Sweden, so it's basically a home of the bishop for the diocese, and it's possibly the oldest bishopric north of the Alps. So this is a very ancient, for the time being, religious structure. And I had to go find some pictures because this is such an interesting sounding place. So this is one of the locations that I found, and this is just a random lake in the Valais area, but it looks so peaceful and so beautiful, and most of the areas, and I'll pull up a few more pictures here in a minute, from that area that I found were just amazing. The place today, you would never know that it was covered in blood just a few years ago, well, 300 years ago, but or closer to 6 now that I'm thinking about it. Anyway, where was that? And so, even though it's a very beautiful place, I have said this before about the witch trials that started around the early 1400s and went through the mid to late 1700s. There are some who think that they may have continued even into the 1800s. We'll kind of get into that a little bit later, just kind of seeing what's going on there. This area, though, in Valais, is where it all started in 1428. Most of the information that I could find is linked back to the court reporter of that area, who was Johannes Freund. He was from Lucerne. He published all of his works and all of his reports, started publishing, I should say, around 1430. The downside is I cannot find anything that's not in German to be able to go back to, so most of what I found is just internet research, because I could not find a English translation of this book, and I was hunting for a while because I would like to read what he actually wrote there, not have someone else's opinion. But we'll get going here. The time, as I said, for the early 1400s, especially in this area, was a very volatile time for both religious and spiritual people, as well as the politics of this region of Valais. Things were fracturing all over the place. There were political factions that were fighting with each other. The Switzerland's government at the time could not get control of its people because they were still fighting over royal houses. France was doing a little bit better, but this area is on the cusp between the two, so there's a really rough air patch going on here. There's another event, spiritual event, that I kind of want to go over later, and this overlaps perfectly with this time period, was the persecution of the Waldensians in Fribourg. And this is all tied into another event, which is the Council of Basel, which amplified all of this insanity. There's a lot going on in this 50-year period here. And the Council of Basel, the reason this stirred up so much controversy was there was a bunch of stuffy theologians that got wedged in a hall somewhere, and they decided to discuss the evidence of witchcraft and how they would persecute it and destroy it. Good job. They would use reports from Valais, Vaud, and Savoy, and it was from this council that the plague of the witch hunts would spread across Europe into the United States and various other pockets around the world. It is speculated, and I tend to agree with this theory, that the hunts over all of this, the witch hunts in general, were politics and greed motivated. Once the fervor of fear was spread, the fear of your soul, the fear of your livelihood, fill in the blanks, it was easy to keep fear and threats going once you get it started. This led to massive power grabs by the government and the churches of this time. And it is theorized that this actually opened the door to the massive power growth and grab by both the political worlds of the area and the Catholic Church as a whole. Not knocking it, this is what went on at the time, so this is just history. This was a time that was exceptionally wild, and like I said, there's a lot that goes on here. We're focusing on one aspect, so off to the witches we go, or at least the people who were accused of being witches. There were two areas in Valais that were primary to this particular story we're going into. One is this amazingly beautiful area here, which is the Val d'Anvers, and the other one is, where'd it go? There it is. And I just thought this was cool. This is the road going into the Val de Herens. So this is the South Valley side of the Ciders and Sion area of France, Switzerland. It's this little section here between the two. But this, I just thought this was a cool picture. On top of each of these plinths, you have a rock because the way the erosion went, and they put a road through it. I don't know. I just thought it was cool. But that's, I mean, the area we're looking into here is absolutely beautiful. It's just the nightmare that we're talking about. It didn't take long for the madness, once it got started, to spread across the entire south part of Valais, which was the French part. It would eventually spread to the upper regions that were predominantly German. And from what I could gather, this started really small. It was little things, a random death in the area, a stillborn calf, crops that just didn't produce like they were supposed to. And eventually, this little bit of unrest in the early 1400s would lead to delegates from 7 different districts of Valais to petition their authorities, demand I think was the official word, to look into these areas and demand that they research and find out where the witches were, because it had to be because of witchcraft. The church says so, this is what's going on. Superstition was very strong, so it had to be the witches. Go find the witches. And this little delegation of 7 created some disastrous consequences coming out of it. A formal decree from the ruling government, this is the main government, not the religious government, was issued in 1428 about the procedures for hunting and trying witches. The church was not going to be left out, so they put their 2 cents in and eventually got control over the actual hunts, but not the trials and executions. And it was stated at the time between the 2 different groups, the church and the government, that if 3 or 4 neighbors were to talk or slander a person, that is the official phrase, talk or slander a person, that person would be arrested immediately. They needed a minimum of 3 accusations to start proceedings, is what that boils down to. And no one, not one person, was immune from these accusations, including the nobility. Many nobles got tossed into this mix. And it was said that once 5 to 10 people accused a person of witchcraft, torture was the next obvious step. I mean, like, why not? You've already been accused of witchcraft, let's throw you on the rack. And it didn't matter if it was 3 people or the full 10. Once the victim was accused, they were arrested immediately, they were tried for sorcery, then sentenced to death. There really was not anything else going on. Talk about kangaroo court or whatever you want to call it. This was a disgusting abuse of power. And I'm glad that today we have a few more requirements for trials, things like, evidence, genuine witnesses, juries, things like that. I do find it interesting, though, that the wording of the texts were using the term slander for their witnesses. Slander, by definition, I wanted to make sure I had this accurate, so this is straight from the dictionary, is a malicious, false, or defamatory statement or report, and it also can be a defamation by oral utterance rather than by writing, pictures, etc. So it's being not truthful to begin with. That is the purpose of slander. So it's interesting that they use that as the term in their legal treaties. And it's like they kind of knew what they were doing was the wrong thing, so they kind of put it out there without putting it out there. And as I said before, the main person that wrote this was Johann Frund. I wanted to make sure I got his name in here because the next few paragraphs that I wrote were focusing on him. According to Frund, the accused witches were slandered under the charges of murder, sorcery, and heresy. And he also would write that they were making pacts with the devil himself. This is the beginning of all this, so we're going to define some of these things just to make sure that we're on the same page. Murder, basically, that's unaliving somebody. That's basic, that's general. Heresy, though, had some interesting definitions as I dug through it. One of which is to go against the orthodox or mainstream religious belief. In that case, it was going against the Catholic Church. It was to reject the articles of faith from a person or authority. So if you turned your back on your bishop, your priest, your cardinal, your pope, you were a heretic. And the other part about that was heresy and the term witch were interchangeable at this time. So in base definition, according to this time period, a witch was just someone who didn't follow the church. We call them today a pagan or something along those lines. So that puts a little bit of a different spin on what they were actually accusing these people of when we look at it from that historical concept. The other word that I wanted to flesh out a little bit was being accused of sorcery. By definition, it is the art, practice or spells of a person practicing black magic, specifically with the aid of evil spirits. So these were demon summoners. It's also can be traced back to the early 1200s as someone who casts lots, a diviner or a fortune teller. And I'm gonna go with the first one, or the second meaning, because even during that time period you had people who cast lots all the time. That's a common thing. But during the time of our tale, the term was mostly used as a hostile one, saying that these people were working with black magic and making pacts with the devil. This one is a little bit more disturbing. A pact with the devil is to sign a contract with a demon or the devil himself, and you sell your soul to the devil. It's been talked about in movies. Mephistopheles and some of the other literature out there is really good aspects of it. But in this time period, the devil would appear as a bear or ram, jet black eyeballs, no whites whatsoever. The devil in this form would force the sorcerer or the accused witch to sign his book in their own blood to bind this contract or spell. Once the pact had been made, the sorcerer would have supernatural abilities to curse, to harm, and to do other mysterious things. They were told that they were never allowed to go to confession again, which, if you go by the actual biblical research, you shouldn't have an intercessor like that. That's what Jesus came here for, the basis of Catholicism. And you were to avoid mass at all costs. That one was a little strange. But according to Freund, the accused witches were tortured up into the point of death. Sometimes they were killed and they were still torturing them because apparently the torturers enjoyed their jobs. Not all victims were said to have confessed, though, and this is the part where things get a little dicey, and this sets the stage for what comes later. Some did confess under torture, but not all. The ones that did would make claims that are hard to believe even today, and in that time period would really be head-scratchers. They claimed they could make someone lame, cause them to go mad, trigger blindness, the supernatural powers they were conjuring. It was also said that they could cause impotence in men, miscarriages in women, and overall fertility in a household, including their animals, their chickens, even their farms not to produce. Some of the more disturbing confessions, and I had to go digging because some of the first couple pages, when you're looking up stuff, would just say, and there were other things. Well, I want to know what those are. So I dug around a little bit, and it was a form of cannibalism, and that's one of the reasons they didn't want to talk about it. And this one's disturbing. So if you have a sensitive stomach or you're not really into this kind of stuff, definitely, check back in about 2 minutes. They claimed that the women would get pregnant, carry a baby to term. Once it was birthed, they would sacrifice said child and then devour the remains in the name of the devil incarnate. Not really sure where that concept even came from. There's a couple of ancient deities that thought that was cool, but in this time period, and especially in this area, those deities were not popular. So, torture does interesting things to people. And my big thought on all of this right now so far is these clergymen, these pious individuals, they had to have been straight up insane or just evil. Under torture, people will say anything to make it stop. And I can only imagine what the clergy of that time were encouraging the victims to say just to satisfy some depraved urge. And I'm not knocking modern day, I'm specifically going after this time period. So, there was the tortures that they would do were unreal. They would break bones, which was a pretty common one. Snapping fingers, that was another big one. Another popular one that was, well, not popular, another one that was made popular at this particular time period in the early 1400s was we'd call it today waterboarding. Back then it was fear drowning, where you would plunge the witch underwater and then hold them there till the bubbles almost stop, then pull them back up, and then confess, and they don't confess, back down they go. So it was just psychological, physical, brutal knives, and unpleasantness to say the least. But this was kind of the raw beginning of some of the really bad stuff that happened later. Freund, the historian, or the court reporter, also brought up the idea that these witches could fly, some of their supernatural abilities that they had gained. But it's not as cool as like Angela Lansbury in Bedknobs and Broomsticks flying around leading her army of empty soldiers. In his confessions that he took, or at least recorded, the witches would fly on chairs and I'm not kidding, like they specifically stated wooden chairs. He said that the witches confessed to being taught how to make a salve that they would put all over the chair, legs, back, seat, all of it. And then once they sat themselves into the chair with a thought, they could travel anywhere that they wanted to. Witches' salves are interesting because most of them have toxic levels of, henbane and hellborn and things like that. So who knows what really they were experiencing, to be honest. Great hallucinations before they died, possibly. But it was still interesting. Not brooms, they flew on chairs. Freund also would go on to describe the Sabbaths of the witches. He said that the witches claimed they would meet in various root cellars. They would get drunk on wine that they had stolen from their neighbors. The devil would appear once they were fully lit. But in this instance, the devil would show up as a schoolmaster, dressed in all black, black eyes, black nails, and he would preach an anti-Christian sermon. Of course he would. The devil schoolmaster would then demand confessions from all of his followers. But these confessions weren't, "I'm sorry, I swore at my neighbor yesterday." These confessions were of all the good deeds they'd committed. "I held the door open for my wife yesterday," like, "Oh my goodness, I can't even believe I did that." Or, "I helped a child across the street, I should have kicked him." Things like that. Like, these were the confessions these people were admitting to. And it's completely the opposite of the Catholic confessions, where you confess your sins and the wrong deeds. He was like, no, I want you to tell me all the good things you did, and then go out and do bad things to counteract that. Some of the more fanciful accusations or confessions were of turning into werewolves. And I didn't even realize this was a thing. They would turn into a wolf, and once in wolf form, the witches would hunt and kill livestock just for the fun of it. They would leave the carcasses scattered all around the property. Couldn't be a rogue wolf pack in the area or anything like that, because those don't exist. It had to be shape-shifting witches. And this was a rabbit hole I started to go down. I had to stop myself. Because of this event, it started 2 sets of trials. I didn't realize this. One was the witch trials, which we've been talking about. But there actually started a second set of trials called the werewolf trials. This was a much smaller event. It only went on for a couple hundred years versus, the 400 of the other. But there actually was an entire set of rules about hunting werewolves, how to identify a werewolf, what to do once you found a werewolf. There was a whole new set of trials. So that might be something I dig into later. I haven't quite decided. I just thought it was an interesting side note there. Johann Freund would also allude to a potion that was taught to the witches by the devil to render them invisible strictly from herbals and ointments, which would allow the witch to bedevil a person without being seen, causing them to trip and break legs, hiding their keys, or not keys back in the day, but, hiding things that were important to them, or stealing money or stealing the wine, who knows. Then there was the usual fare that we've already discussed at various points: crop failures, livestock aborting babies, not giving milk, chickens not laying eggs, illness, death, broken bones, all that things. And it's those things that, happen in nature from time to time. A drought occurs, your animals are not going to produce milk, and they're not going to have healthy babies. But no, it had to be the witches that did all this. And this went on for years in Valais. Most believe this set of trials wrapped up sometime between 1434 and 1436, but there's actually other evidence from other records that say it actually went on until 1448. So this was not a couple years. This was, give or take, 20 years of this nonsense just in this one valley, or this one area. The exact number of witches hunted is completely unknown, which is a typical thing because they kept records, but they didn't want people to know exactly how bad they were, so they kept really loose records. Freund would claim that there were over 700 suspected witches in the first 2 years. 2 years. When you look at the area here, we're talking this was half quarter to half of the population, depending on which number you read. That's a lot of people. Also a lot of land that will suddenly be available for purchase. And then in that first 2 years, over 200 of those 700 people accused were burned. And if you break that down year by year, that's a give or take 100 a year. And if you really want to give yourself a nightmare, that's one person burned at the stake or beheaded. That was the other option they had at this point, every 3 days or so. That's how, I mean, they were torching them and whacking heads off right and left over there. And these areas are not big. Like I said, there's not a lot of people there, and there were smaller, not incorporated villages, but smaller pockets that were completely wiped out during this time period. And it was all because of lies, slander. They even said it was slander. The rest of the fervor did eventually die down. As I said, around 1448, the majority of this nonsense in this area stopped. And the damage to the psyche, though, of the people had been done. Their fear had been struck, and the church saw a way to gain unbelievable power over the land and the people. This set of trials was unique in a lot of ways, and there's two in particular I want to talk about. One was, this was the first official formal witch hunt. This was sanctioned by the government of France and Switzerland, weirdly enough, and it was also formally sanctioned by the church. Prior to that, you'd have a random person here or there that needed an exorcism or did something that made people suspicious, so they'd take out that one person, or there might have been a 2 or 3. It was never on the scale of what the Valais one started. This started the nonsense that went on, and this was a little interesting one as well. The very first witch hunt was in this area, France-Switzerland border. The very last official, quote-unquote, official witch hunt was in 1748, 1758, something like that, in Switzerland. So Switzerland kind of got tied into the beginning and the end of this whole chaotic period. And that's another another person, because there's actually some good information about her, so I'll go over her as a story unto herself. The other part that was unique, in my opinion anyway, of the Valais witch hunts is the victims were predominantly male. Of course, you needed the land. Who owned the land? The men. It is suspected that around 2/3 of the total people murdered at this time were men. The rest were women, and thankfully, and I'm sorry, but that is something I'm thankful for, no children were actually hunted in this first one. Not one child. They were all basically of bearing age, so between 15 and 18 were the youngest ones. The oldest ones could be as old as 60. They went after the men predominantly because during this time period in this area, the men were the ones that controlled the land. Even a poor man could own property. And if you took out them, the women didn't have any right to the land. There were some spots where women could get rights, especially if they were well educated or of noble descent. They would be able to retain their land, but that was not very common in this time period. So they specifically went after the men in this point for the purpose of acquiring all this land. And also, how else do you demean a people? You take out the heads of the households, and in this time period, again, that was the men. So you take out all of that, you automatically weaken the entire area. It was very easy to step in as a government, take it over, and really lock that area down for the governments of France and Switzerland. France had really good control over their land. That's the one thing that they've had for way too many years. But Switzerland, like I said earlier, they were kind of at war with each other. You had all the royal houses. They were trying to unify under one, like, I think it was monarchy at the time, and it just wasn't working out so well. But this was a way to fear them, scare them. Well, if you don't submit to the state's authority, we just might have to assume you're a witch because you're being very heretical in how you act. And suddenly they're like, oh yeah, monarchy sounds cool. But there was one person towards the end of all this chaos that actually was named as an actual witch. And there's like 5 sentences written about this poor woman. It was towards the end, like I said, it was 1447 was when she was arrested. She was actually executed in 1448. Her name was Catherine Quique. I believe it's the way I have it written out here phonetically, but she was accused of witchcraft, or heresy is what the other term was. She confessed under torture to the people who introduced her to the darkness, and what they did at their Sabbats. We already went over all that. And how she had met the devil in the form of a talking fox, jet black fox that talked to her. And then she also described the group that she was with and who they had worked all their magic against. Whether you could prove any of it or not, I don't know, and it was not recorded that I could find. But because of her admitting to doing these things, she was burned that year. And it was mentioned multiple times as I was digging through her stuff that Catherine came forward on her own. No one accused her. She chose, for whatever reason, to out herself as a witch. Now, whether that was like, oh, I'm doing my Christian duty because I don't want to go to hell, didn't really work out for you there, kid, but, or whatever her purpose was, she chose to out herself as a witch, and then instead of just taking that as her word and putting her on trial, they insisted on torturing her. And I don't understand this. They admit to it, try them for their crime. Nope, gotta torture them first. And she named 5 or 6 other people who'd already died. So again, what was the purpose there? And when she described their Sabbats, she literally described everything I already went over. They stole wine. They went over to other people's pantries, root cellars, got all toasted, went and rode their chairs around, which still sounds funny to say. But the big difference with her was she met the devil in the form of a talking fox versus a bear or a goat. So, yeah, but that's where everything that started. This is where the chaos began. And when they talk about burning, I just want to bring this up real quick, because when we think of burning at the stake, we think of, being tied to a stake and all the logs piled up around you and the person in the middle screaming. Think Elvira from the 80s. But what they would do, and this is twisted as all get out, is the witch would be tied to a ladder, leaning back, as you can see here, and she would be bound with he or she would be bound with her arms to her side, or his side. They would tie a bag around the person's neck that was packed full, according to the research, of gunpowder. Then, you're leaning back. They would have a person either pushing you up, or they would have a rope at the top pulling you over the flames. You hoped that the gunpowder went off before the flames got to you, because if the gunpowder went off, you were instantly gone, because it took out this entire section. But these were public things. This was something that you brought the entire town out to, men, women, children, because this was a way to scare people into being good Christians or whatever. All this did was cause more problems, because after the first one was accused and this happened, then it went on to, oh, well, I saw that person, they didn't go to mass last week, or that person said something weird, or their animals are fine and mine all got sick. The fear and the panic spread like a disease, because it is. And that's what they were doing. But this was the weird thing about their burning, is they put you on a ladder and tip you over the fire. There is a movie back in the day called Black Sunday with Barbara Steele. It's out of print right now, which is really sad. But they show this, a couple of other parts as well. But they do show this aspect of being tipped into the fire over a ladder. It was also brought forward, weirdly enough, in a video game movie adaptation called Silent Hill, in the first one. It's a really gory movie, don't get me wrong, but they have this where you tip the witch over the fire because purifies their souls from all the darkness by, you know, burning the body up. This is where this all started. Prior to this, you'd have the random, as I said, random witch. Burning was kind of a common thing, and I was curious as to how far back I could trace that. It goes back to Rome, like back in the day Rome, like in single digits AD Rome is when they would find someone who's doing something heretical or evil. They would burn them in the town square. But the whole hanging them over the fire with the gunpowder thing, that started here. And the process of burning mass quantities of them started at Valais. So this is this is where the group thing became big. From here to the next official witch hunt was around 35 to 40 years, and then it moved into the next section of mass hysteria, but it was based off of what happened here. And what happens at Valais, what happens at Valais sets up the people who wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, the Compendium Maleficarum, and some of the other works of witch hunting, including King James the Fourth's, I think it was, Demonology. And he was inspired by these bozos to write his book. And I'm currently working through reading that because it was years ago that I read it, so I'm rereading it. It is so obscure and so odd and how he phrased things. But kind of wanted to give us a little bit of background and some footing as to where all this began, other than just talking about the horror, where we start. And now we're going to move on through to the rest of them. I have a couple other big names of the hunters that I want to go over, one of which is King James. And when I do the King James one, I'm going to go through his demonology at the same time, because it's rambly, but then there's other points where he's making some odd connections that I'm not sure if are truly, biblical like he claims they are. But with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. There wasn't a lot about this. Most of the information was like you get a paragraph here and a paragraph there. So the Valais ones were mainly brought up because it was the first. So if you know of other witch hunters, if you know of other witch sections that you would like me to look into, dig into a little bit more, let me know in the chat or the comment section. And otherwise, I will see you guys and gals in the next episode, and have a great rest of your week. And don't burn anybody at the stake.